Hi, welcome back. In this video, we're going to be looking at the first part of what we think of as the civil rights movement. We'll be looking at the 1940s and the 1950s. I think this is one of the most important lectures to go through because I feel like we've forgotten a lot about the civil rights movement as a society. I don't mean that we've forgotten that it existed. I don't mean that we've forgotten the events that happened. But I feel like we've forgotten two important things. Number one, what led to the civil rights movement? What was life like under segregation? And number two, what did the people who fought for civil rights actually have to go through? We've sanitized it so much and boiled it down to a couple of pages and some key terms and people and vocabulary. But we've forgotten that people had to fight and people died during the civil rights movement for the right to be treated equally. And so please keep that in mind as we go through these notes, and there will be another set of notes later covering the 1960s. I encourage you to look up more on the civil rights movement than just what is presented here. Even if it is something, local to you. What was life like in your town before the civil rights movement, during the civil rights movement, and after the civil rights movement? Let's try to make sure that the people that fought for this didn't fight for nothing, that we're continuing this struggle to make sure everyone is treated equally. All right, let's go ahead and get into it. We're going to get into it with a little refresher, a little background. Okay? If you think back to the period immediately after Reconstruction, during the Gilded Age, what was going on in the South? When Reconstruction first ended, the South did not have a organized plan for segregation. Instead, what we saw was the rise of something called de facto segregation. De facto is going to be Latin for segregation in fact. Segregation by the way things just were. Okay? People followed traditions. They followed customs. After a few years, the South is going to start implementing the Jim Crow laws. The Jim Crow laws establish what we call de jure segregation. Segregation by law. It's enshrined. It's legal. And so these two things are different, and we'll cover these later, because de facto segregation is just the way things shake out. People will generally tend to live with people that are like them. If you kind of study those classic immigration patterns, you've seen that. Segregation by law is different. So it's codified. It is required that people live here, sit there. If you think of the background here, it is established in law that people had to use separate water fountains. And again, that stuff wasn't really organized. One state would do something, one locality would do something, but there wasn't a system for it until 1895. In 1895, in the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, if you remember, the Supreme Court legalized that Jim Crow system, and they legalized that de jure segregation, saying that this was fine. And they created what we know as the separate but equal doctrine. The idea that whites and blacks could have separate things as long as they were equal. Now, of course, to the Supreme Court, that was the idea in 1896 that the facilities would actually be equal, that you would have the same facilities. In the South, in their mind, separate but equal meant you at least had the same availability. If you will look at the background picture as I clear that out, this was separate but equal according to the South, according to that Jim Crow system. Each side has a water fountain. Here we have our water fountain for the whites, here our water fountain for the African Americans. The differences, though, they're not equal. For our African American water fountain, you can see it's just the water coming out of the pipe. For the whites, we have this big box. For those of you that don't know what this box is, this is where the compressor is. That's the part of the water fountain that chills the water. And so when you went to take a drink, if you're black, you're going to get room temperature water. And depending on where you live, depending on the pipes, in the summer, the water could actually come out hot. If you're white, though, you're going to get that more refreshing, colder water. And in nobody's mind should that be equal, but it was. All right, moving on. In the early 1900s, you had the formation of the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, which we've talked about before, and that group fought for integration in the United States. And they did that through using different means. Probably the most well-known way was through using lawsuits, suing states and individuals over the laws and the treatment of African Americans, trying to build up a legal background and precedent for later overturning segregation. But they also investigated racist incidents. Okay, if you remember back to the first Red Scare immediately after World War I and the race riots that existed in 1919, 1920, 1921, some of the big ones that made headlines around the country, the NAACP sent people down to investigate what happened, how did this start, did they start over, what was the rumor that got them started, and then exactly what happened afterwards. Because in the South especially, a lot of these incidents, they would downplay the violence. Oh yes, there were some people killed, but it wasn't that many. Well, it could have been hundreds. In addition, the NAACP would also lobby. They would be involved in lobbying, and that's where you go and you try to convince lawmakers to vote a certain way. And so they tried to get Congress to pass anti-discrimination laws and anti-lynching laws, and they worked on state governments as well. Now, the NAACP is not without controversy. The NAACP is criticized during this early part of the 1900s by the African American community because oftentimes it will pick and choose the court cases it will take up. One of those big controversies was in the 1930s, a group called the Scottsboro Boys. The Scottsboro Boys, they were a group of African-American teenagers in the 1930s during the Depression. They were riding on a train. Now, this was illegal. It's illegal to jump the train. And the railroad companies would often employ private investigators to go through rail yards and try to find people that were hitchhiking on the railroads. When these boys were discovered, there were also 2 white women in the train car with them. Okay, this is a freight train. This isn't a passenger train. This is a freight train. Everybody, the boys and the women, were taken to the police station and they were interrogated. After being held for 24 hours, the 2 women signed statements saying that they had been raped. Now, they didn't say that when they went to the police. They didn't say that for an entire day. It's after 24 hours. So, in your mind, you should equate that with something is wrong here. Someone is not telling the truth. The women were coerced into signing these false statements. Now, you're in the South in the 1930s. These young men are going to be put on trial. They're going to face not only long prison sentences, potential death sentences for rape in the 1930s. The NAACP originally would not take the case. It was seen as unwinnable. Each of these guys already had a rap sheet. And for the NAACP, they said, look, when our lawyers go down there and the prosecution says, look, here's this person's rap sheet, and here's the petty theft, and here's the further crime, and here's the assault and battery. Is it logical that they could make the next jump to rape? It's going to be too hard to defend them, so sorry, you're on your own. Now, eventually the NAACP would step in to help. But it was only after the Communist Party of the United States said that they would defend them. Because all of a sudden the NAACP did not want the cause of civil rights being equated with the cause of communism. And so there were people who didn't like the NAACP. If you also remember the 1920s, you remember a group called Universal Negro Improvement Association, and their founder, Marcus Garvey. Well, they were an alternative to the NAACP, but they didn't actually fight for integration. They were actually opposed to integration. If you look down at the nitty-gritty of it, Marcus Garvey at one point even attempted to make a deal with the leaders of the KKK, kind of a you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone kind of deal. Okay? So the NAACP, in some instances, is also having to work around people in the African American community who are also opposed to integration. But for the most part, that wasn't the big thing. UNIA and Marcus Garvey promoted black nationalism and black separatism. For some future notes, something to know, Marcus Garvey, some of the people that followed him would be called Garveyites. One of the men that followed Marcus Garvey was the father of Malcolm X. We'll talk about him in a later lecture, but just to kind of give you a little heads up that these ideas run through the decades. All right, so now we get into the 1940s, and if you remember to World War II, we should have talked about the Double V campaign, where the African American community worked for what they called victory abroad, victory at home. Victory over Hitler and Japan, and victory over segregation and discrimination. The idea that if African Americans fought for the country in World War II and did the things that would show they were patriotic American citizens, that the country would turn around and say, you know what, you fought for a country that didn't give you your rights. That's wrong. You should be given your rights, and we should make up for that. Now, the country didn't. Part of me feels that I guess we could say, failure of the Double V campaign is what spurred on the civil rights movement. In 1942, there's going to be another group that is founded. Okay? It's called the Congress of Racial Equality, and we abbreviate that as CORE. Okay? So there are several groups that we need to be aware of here. The NAACP, CORE. Okay? One of the things that CORE is going to do is they're going to be involved in more what we might think of as active protests. The NAACP, to this point, doesn't really engage in protest. They're the lawsuits. They're the lobbyists. CORE is going to take more of a stand. They're going to be involved in these active protests. They are going to stage some of the first sit-ins, and we will talk about sit-ins later. The sit-in demonstration, what they came to be. But they would engage in protests at work, at segregated facilities, where all the workers would sit down, okay, what we might call a sit-down strike of some point. We also should have been through by this point. In 1948, one of the great gains for civil rights, Truman's integration of the military. And if you remember, this was also an election year. And politically, this may not have been the best thing for Harry Truman to do, because he was running for re-election, and there was some speculation this was going to be a very close race. But Truman, to his credit, said, if this is the right thing to do, it doesn't matter if it costs me the White House. It's the right thing to do. All right, so now we're going to get to some new stuff we haven't gone over in class before, maybe. The NAACP in the 1950s is going to start changing their strategy. Now, they're still going to use the lawsuits, but they're going to start suing in a specific direction. They're going to start working on education. And they adopted what they referred to as the three-pronged strategy. They're going to fight for equal education, but they're going to go at it from three different directions. First, they're going to fight for equal transportation. Many schools in the South would have county schools. So the entire county is one school district. And they would put one school for African Americans, which would be fine for the African Americans that lived near that school, but if you lived on the other side of the county and you were black, you had to be able to get to the school. Well, if you look at the size of the counties, that may be prohibitive because of the distance involved for someone to take you to school and then to pick you up and bring you back. And so the NAACP started fighting for transportation, for buses to have to take the kids to school. Your school district is now going to have to shell out more money for more buses and for gas. Secondly, they start fighting for equal teacher pay. Teachers who worked at the segregated schools, teachers who worked at the black schools, did not make as much money. And so if you were a good teacher, you wanted to make more money that's just normal, and you really could not afford to live on a teacher's salary at a black school. And so it doesn't matter how much you love the kids, at some point you would have to break down and you would have to get a job at the white school if you wanted to make ends meet. Okay? And so the better teachers ended up being hired at the white school because they had, I'm going to pay you more money, you'd better be a better teacher for the kids. This also meant that the teachers that went to the black school weren't necessarily as qualified. And so they started fighting for equal teacher pay. And that's going to allow good teachers who want to teach African Americans and give them a good education. It's going to allow them to survive on what they're being paid, even though they're teaching at the segregated school. The third area of attack was equal access to college education. I see the NAACP is going at this. They took a top-down approach. Okay, let's go for these people. Let's help people who are actively seeking to do something in a career. And from this third prong, we have two really significant court cases. The first one here is McLaren versus Oklahoma. In this case, what happened was Mr. McLaren wanted to go to OU and pursue graduate studies. He was already had an advanced degree, but he got those in Kansas. OU is segregated. And there's actually two parts to this case. The first part, he applied to OU and was denied admittance because he was black. And the Supreme Court ruled that, no, he had to be allowed, that this kind, not allowing him to this graduate program was unfair. So he was allowed into OU, but he was forced to sit in what is called an anteroom, a room off to the side of the main classroom. And in some cases, he was actually made to sit at a desk out in the hall, outside of the classroom, so that the other students could not see him, so they could maintain some vestige of segregation. Well, he sued again, saying that this treatment in itself was unequal, and that's the case we talk about here, McLaren versus Oklahoma, where the Supreme Court ruled that such differential treatment was a violation of his rights under the 14th Amendment. And so this court case forced the University of Oklahoma to integrate. That same year, there's another case, Sweat versus Painter. This one comes out of Texas. Right? Mr. Sweat was interested in becoming a lawyer, and he was interested in pursuing a law degree at the University of Texas. UT Law School was segregated, and so originally the state of Texas was going to try to compromise. There was only one law school in the state of Texas, and it was at UT. And so the state of Texas decided that they would create a law school at Texas Southern University, which was one of the segregated universities. However, because of the timing and how this Texas state legislature works, they would create the law school, but there was no funding for it, for books or professors. And so he was told he could begin his studies as independent study. He could kind of make up the classes that he wanted. The Supreme Court ruled that this in itself would cause his degree to be worth less than a comparable degree at UT Law School, and so UT was forced to admit him. Now, these two court cases are extremely important because they're integrating higher education, arguing that these two gentlemen and society at large needed to have equal access to jobs post-graduation. But they also made up the basis for the later Brown versus Board of Education decision, which hopefully we all know. Okay? One of the people working with the NAACP is this man, Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the lawyer for the Browns and the NAACP in this case. Thurgood Marshall was in charge of the education program of the NAACP, but he was also a lawyer. In the Supreme Court hearing, he used the studies conducted by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. They were sociologists, and they did these experiments. You can Google it. They're called the doll experiments. And you see the picture down here in the bottom left of the young African-American kid playing with the two dolls. He's picked the white doll. What happened, what they did in these doll experiments is they went to little kids and they presented them with two dolls, a black doll and a white doll, and asked them to pick one of them and to describe which one was better. And the black kids all picked the white doll and said this one was better. And that's not something they were being told at home. Their parents weren't telling them this. What was telling them this was everything they saw in society. Everything they saw in society said that white was better than black. And they were able, through these experiments, to show that segregation discrimination was doing damage to these kids and their own self-worth and their own self-esteem. And so the Supreme Court in Brown v. Board of Education unanimously struck down segregation in education, saying in the decision that separate is inherently unequal. What this does, this reverses the case Plessy versus Ferguson. Now, this was not the end of segregation in education. A group of Southern politicians, congressmen, state leaders, wrote something called the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto denounced the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Okay? Southerners would demand that the federal government stay out of state affairs and that education was a state affair. Nowhere in the Constitution did it say that education was something the national government should provide, that it was all left to the states. And so the South continued to fight against this. Right? In 1956, there was another court case. It's called Brown 2, Brown v. Board of Education. According to the Brown v. Board of Education decision, all schools were required to integrate. This court case, Brown 2, was over how quickly did they need to integrate. And unfortunately here, the Supreme Court kind of punted or passed the buck. They said in their ruling that desegregation needed to proceed with all deliberate speed. And by the time you got to 1968, so we're more than 10 years later, I think something like 4% of all public schools in the South were desegregated. So all deliberate speed, what does that mean? In some cases, there were school districts who, early on at least, drug their feet and tried not to desegregate. Dallas ISD is one that comes to mind. They drug their feet and they did not desegregate. Somewhere around 1980, the district did get new leadership, and the district did decide, okay, they were going to desegregate. But they still had to go to court, and they still had to prove that they were doing things to desegregate. They did not come out from under federal oversight, judicial oversight in their desegregation plans until after the year 2000. And so you're talking, let's just say 50 years since the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Now, perhaps you already know a little bit about the Montgomery Bus Boycott, which happened in Montgomery, Alabama in 1956. It started after the arrest of Rosa Parks. Okay? And maybe you've heard the story that Rosa Parks was a laundress. She was working in a laundry, and that she got on the bus at the end of the day and she was tired and she was going to sit in the seat. Okay? Rosa Parks actually was a volunteer secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. And several months prior to Rosa Parks' arrest, there had been a couple of other young women who had been arrested for violating the city's segregated bus seating. The NAACP did not take up their case, and the NAACP did not hold them up for someone to rally around and protest, because again, the NAACP, these young ladies had rap sheets, and so the NAACP kind of got this idea of, okay, this is the right idea, but you're the wrong people to do it. And Rosa Parks volunteered to put herself in this position. And initially, when she sat on the bus, she was sitting in the right spot. The way these buses operated, as you had fewer white patrons on the bus, there would be fewer seats up at the front, and they would move the segregated seating forward, so African Americans could sit closer toward the front. As more African American riders got off and more white riders got on, they would then move the segregated seating back. And so initially she's sitting in the right spot, and as more white riders got on, they moved the sign, and she refused to get up and move, thus breaking the law requiring the police. But she has no arrest record. She is just a grandmother who has never done anything wrong. And so she was the perfect person to rally around and say what was done to her was unfair. The Montgomery Bus Boycott is also important because this is the first protest that Martin Luther King was chosen to lead, and he became the face of the Montgomery Bus Boycott and the civil rights leaders there in Montgomery. And so this gave him a national platform as he would address the media virtually every day during the boycott, announcing what it was that the people wanted and what it was that they would do throughout the boycott, and what they wanted in order to end it. The boycott lasted just about a year, from December of 1955, after Rosa Parks' arrest, until December of 1956, okay, when the city finally desegregated the buses. And so this is a huge thing, as the civil rights movement, through this peaceful protest, was able to bring an end to segregation on the buses. Now, because this thrust Martin Luther King in the spotlight, he became the symbol of the civil rights movement. He was not the leader. There were many leaders. Okay? Martin Luther King advocated for non-violent protest, okay? Marches, demonstrations. Okay? He drew his inspiration from what Gandhi was doing in India to protest British rule. He used nonviolent protest as well. He also drew inspiration from Henry David Thoreau. And Thoreau's great work, Civil Disobedience, became a keystone for Martin Luther King and what he sought to do. Civil disobedience, the simple definition is deliberately disobeying an unjust law. Now, in doing so, you know you are going to face consequences, but you're going to face those consequences in an attempt to draw attention to the fact that what is happening is wrong. In 1957, Martin Luther King was elected president of another civil rights organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who was made up of a lot of ministers in the South who sought to end segregation. Now, it's important for us to know that the people who fought for civil rights were not in a vacuum. They didn't have a march and that was it, and all of a sudden the segregation ended. They didn't boycott the buses for a year and finally the city said, oh, you know what, okay. White Southerners who supported the segregation system used violence and intimidation to fight back against these protesters. They used the violence and intimidation to try to keep African Americans in their place, so to speak. And it happened since the end of Reconstruction. It continues in mass through the 1960s. There are some people who still use it today. In the 50s, one of the people who became a victim of that violence is this young man, Emmett Till. Emmett Till didn't live in the South. Emmett Till lived in Chicago. He was visiting relatives in the South, and he was accused, you hear some different stories of how it all went down, but he was accused of flirting with a white woman at a grocery store. Whether he said something or whistled at her, whatever. The woman's husband and brother-in-law that night found out who he was. They kidnapped him, they beat him, and they murdered him. This is what they did to him. And I leave this here for you to see. This was a kid. He was 15 years old. And this is two grown men who did this to a 15-year-old kid. Who really did nothing. His mother, when she got his body back, had an open casket at his funeral. The funeral home directors, the ministers told her she needed to have the casket closed because he looked so bad. But she said she wanted the open casket because she didn't understand what was going on in the South. And now she did, and she wanted other people to know what was going on. And this was a way to do it. The men who did it were arrested, but they were acquitted by a jury, an all-white jury. And that became a pattern. That didn't become a pattern. That had been a pattern, and that remained a pattern among juries in the South. African Americans were not allowed to serve on juries. And so all white juries would acquit white people that were accused of killing African Americans over and over and over again. This next incident, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, it takes place a little bit outside of the time period we're looking at. It took place in 1963 when a bomb was planted in the basement of a church. And when that bomb exploded, you can see the damage that it did. 4 young girls were killed in that bombing. Okay? The perpetrators, for years, remained free because juries could not convict them. In one instance, one of the men was a preacher. Claimed to be a preacher. And the jury voted 11-1 to convict him. The one holdout was a woman who said she just couldn't vote to send a preacher to jail. Eventually, those men would at least be brought to justice, but it was decades later when people's attitudes had changed. In 1957, in Little Rock, Arkansas, there's a group of African American students who were going to challenge segregation in schools, the Little Rock Nine. They enrolled at Central High School there in Little Rock. The people of Little Rock sought to keep them from going to school, and originally the crowd turned out and threatened them and yelled at them and scared them. When they tried to return to school, the governor of Arkansas called out the Arkansas National Guard. The National Guard is people that have military training. They're regular people. They have real jobs. They have day jobs. Ooh. But in an emergency, they can be called out and they can put on their military uniform, and not only can the president call them out, but the governors can call them out as well. And so the governor of Arkansas, this man named Orville Faubus, called out the Arkansas National Guard because there was an emergency. These 9 African American kids were trying to get into school. And so the National Guard surrounded the high school to prevent these 9 students from going to school. Now, President Eisenhower is often and rightly criticized for his lack of response to the civil rights movement. Okay? Eisenhower, to a certain extent, was afraid of pushing the issue of civil rights because he saw what was going on in the South and was afraid of prompting potentially another civil war. And so he took a back seat to the civil rights movement. Well, the Little Rock Nine forced Eisenhower into a position where he had to take a stand. Right? He called Faubus and said, the Supreme Court has said you must integrate schools, and you cannot keep these students out. And the governor of Arkansas said, basically, what are you going to do about it? And so President Eisenhower did something we call federalizing the National Guard. As president, he also has authority over the National Guard, and so he ordered the National Guard to leave, and then he sent in the 101st Airborne. The 101st Airborne is a division in the United States Army that they are paratroopers. They have special training. Not only are they paratroopers, they have more training, more physical training, generally thought of as being more intimidating, and he sent in the 101st Airborne to protect the students. Because the students would be allowed to go to school. Right? This is the famous photo of the students finally being allowed into the school, and you have the Airborne there protecting them. If you notice some of the details in the photo, notice the ends of the rifles that the Airborne have. They have fixed bayonets. This is a sign you're trying to intimidate a crowd, because what you don't see in this photo is what's behind the photographer, and that is the angry crowd that has been yelling at these students and is threatening to storm into the school to attack the students that are there. Arkansas would respond by closing all schools in order to make sure that these kids were not allowed to get their education that year. That brings us to 1960. 1960, there's going to be a new movement that begins in Greensboro, North Carolina. The first student sit-in occurs. It occurs at a Woolworth's department store at something called a lunch counter. Okay. Perhaps many of you know what a Waffle House is. So if you can imagine a department store like a Macy's or a Dillard's or something like that, with a Waffle House inside of it, that's your lunch counter. Lunch counters in the South were segregated, and if you were black, you could not sit at the counter. And so these 4 African American students said that they were going to sit there until they were served. And that's going to be one of the things that the students, especially during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, will do. They'll have sit-ins at the segregated lunch counters. Okay. We'll talk more about those later. I'm going to start off a different lecture with something on that. But that was a scary thing. And like I said, we'll talk more about that later. Students are going to get more involved. Around 1960, there's a new group that forms called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or we pronounce that abbreviation as SNCC. It actually came out of CORE and the sit-in movement. In 1960, at a national gathering of members of CORE, there were college-age students there, and they wanted CORE to do more confrontational protests. CORE's doing active protests, but they're not being maybe as confrontational as the students wanted them to be. And so some of the leaders in CORE got the students together because the leadership of CORE said, no, we don't want to do that. We want to keep doing it the way we're doing it. But some of the leaders went to the students and said, look, here's the deal. We're a little bit older and we're kind of set in our ways and we have a strategy. You guys need to form your own organization and take your own path. We'll be there to support you and we'll be there to stand by you, but it gives you a voice and it gives the movement another avenue with which to attack segregation. Okay? So these were students who wanted to engage in more protests. SNCC is going to found groups on many different college campuses, especially in the South, especially at the historically black colleges and universities, but also on the universities that were starting to integrate. And so they would recruit college students for their group. That brings us to the end. This is a little bit longer than normal, but like I said at the beginning, I think it's important for us to recognize just exactly what went on during the Civil Rights Movement and how hard it was for people to fight for the right to be treated equally.